Hello, ladies and gentlemen of La Vista Junior High 7th grade science. This is Mrs. Sturgeon speaking. You're going to have to do without Mr. Schlegel this time. I know you're going to be upset about that. And we are here for another online lecture, and this time it is starting an entirely new subject about genetics. And if you'd like to follow along in your book, this is Chapter 3. We're starting a new chapter. Lesson 1 starts on page 74, and it goes to 79. You might find it helpful to kind of follow along as we go. All right, so first up, have you ever wondered why, hopefully you've had these thoughts before, wondered why certain people tend to be really tall and some people are doomed to be short? Maybe you've wondered why all Dalmatians, or wondered if all Dalmatians have spots. Maybe you've wondered why some people are redheaded or super, super blonde or have really, really dark hair. Maybe you've wondered why roses happen to be red generally and violets happen to be blue. Or maybe somebody's told you, oh, you look just like your mother, or you just look just like your father, or you look just like your sister, your brother, okay? Or maybe you look nothing like them and you're curious as to why. Well, today is your lucky day. The answer lies in genetics, okay? Maybe you and your family look really, really, really similar and you can tell everybody's related. Or maybe everybody in your family, you guys look nothing alike and you couldn't even tell that you're related to one another. Or maybe you can think of families here at school or your friends where like all of the siblings look exactly alike and they all look like mom or they all look like dad, okay? And this answer lies in genetics, okay? And genetics has to do with all the way down inside your cells, inside the nucleus, inside the DNA that we have been talking about. This is what we're going to be studying over essentially the next quarter, okay? Back in the day, farmers and herders have really selectively bred for thousands of years, which means they would breed their plants or their animals based on certain traits. Maybe they tasted better, they grew better, maybe their animals were bigger, which means they could get more meat out of them, and they would selectively breed. Maybe they'd take a really big female cow and a really big male cow and breed those and hope that they get really big offspring and continuously do that. And farmers and herders have done this for thousands and thousands of years. So in a sense, people have known about genetics in that sense, but they didn't know exactly what happened or why two big cows would make more big cows. Okay? One theory that people had was called the blending theory, which may work out pretty well. So for example, if a father has black hair and a mother has blonde hair, maybe all of the offspring will have brown hair, which would be a mix or a blend of black and blonde. And that works out for some traits. This blending theory seems to work. However, it can get messy. For example, if dad has brown eyes and mom has blue eyes, then do the offspring end up with a darkish, bluish, brownish eye color? That doesn't really make sense. So people had this idea that traits are like some came from mother and some came from father, but they weren't exactly sure how this all happened until one day a fine young chap named Gregor Mendel decided to investigate a little bit closer. So Gregor Mendel, his picture is over on the right side. He was a German monk, and he, for some reason, decided he wanted to work with pea plants to study genetics, to study how traits are passed on. And he cross-pollinated or cross-fertilized pea plants. He did this with a paintbrush. So this was like hours and hours and hours every day with a paintbrush moving pollen from one plant to another, which is kind of crazy to think about. Typically in nature this is done with like bees and other bugs, but Gregor Mendel wanted to control what was going on, so he did it with a paintbrush. He bred, each time he did a test cross, he bred 1,000 pea plants. And then he pollinated all of them with a paintbrush, which is crazy. Eventually, a scientific law was named after him, and it's called the Law of Mendelian Inheritance. Unfortunately, Gregor Mendel did all this wonderful work. He spent 8 years of his life pollinating pea plants with a paintbrush and doing all his studies, and nobody really cared about his work, even though it was like super, super significant. Nobody cared about it when he was alive. He spent his days doing other research. He even taught high school. And he died before anybody realized, and then after he died, people were like, oh, by the way, this Gregor Mendel guy, he knew it was up. Total bummer. Some words that you will need to know for this section and throughout, and we'll take a deeper look at some of these words today, so if you're a little confused the first time, that's okay, just stick with it. The first word is in our title of our section and our chapter. It's heredity, which is the passing of a trait from one generation to the next. And genetics is the scientific study of heredity, so how this actually happens. A trait, these things that are passed from one generation to the next, are features or characteristics. So some examples would be things like hair color, eye color, spots or stripes on animals, maybe flower color on plants, for example. So anything that basically can be passed on from one generation to the next. Gene, Mendel called these factors, so when you read through your book, you'll kind of come across that term. But genes control traits, so they're actually what makes your hair brown, for example. Each person has upwards of 30,000 genes, and each one of those can be a little bit different. So that's why, except for twins, nobody on Earth looks exactly like one another, which is really cool. An allele is a different form of a gene, and they can be dominant or recessive, and we'll take a closer look at that word here in just a little bit. And finally, fertilization is an important term to know when you're talking about especially Gregor Mendel, and it's the joining of an egg cell and a sperm cell, which can result in a new organism. So in pea plants, whenever Gregor took his paintbrush and he took the pollen from one plant and put it with another, he was hoping to cause fertilization, which would hopefully result in a new organism, which would be the new pea plant, which would be the next generation for him to study. Down at the bottom of your screen, you see the orange, blue, and green boxes, and those are different terms for different generations that we're going to talk about when we talk about genetics. So the first generation in a genetic cross, if a scientist is doing a study, this is called the P generation. It's called the P generation for parent. But if you continue on into several crosses, it will also be known as the grandparent generation, which is a little confusing, but P generation is always first. The F1 generation is the offspring of the first cross, or if the P generation is the grandparent, then the F1 will be the parent. And then finally, F2 generation is the offspring of the second cross, or in this example, the quote-unquote grandchildren. Purebred versus hybrid. These are two more words you'll need to know. Purebred over on the left, we're talking about with our cute little wrinkly puppy there. Purebred is the same form of the trait for generations and generations and generations, and all of the offspring will have that same trait as well. This is also called true breeding, and it can be talking about just one trait. So like maybe, as far as anybody knows, 10 generations back, everybody in the family has had freckles, for example. Okay. It can also talk about the organism as a whole. So we often hear this with things like purebred dogs or purebred horses, like it's a purebred German Shepherd, which means that dog does not have any other type of dog in it. There's only been German Shepherds. Both of its parents were German Shepherds, and both of their parents were German Shepherds, and so on. Okay, so all the generations are the same breed. Now, a hybrid is kind of the opposite of a purebred in that the organism is a result of two different types of purebreds, or not even necessarily purebreds. So, if you're sticking with dogs, it might be more like a mutt, where you're not really sure, or like those, poodle, whatever mixes, poodles and beagles and whatever they do, and puggles. We also see this with, for example, a hybrid car. It's called a hybrid because it's a mix of electric and gas, for example. Okay, so a purebred is everything is the same, at least for a trait or perhaps like a whole breed. A hybrid is a result of two different types of purebreds, or a cross or a mix. So let's take a specific look at Mendel's test cross. Now, he did a whole bunch of these test crosses, but we'll take a look at just one. So pea plant flowers can either be purple or white. There's really no in between with pea plants, which makes it really, really nice to work with. So they're either purple or they're white. So first thing Mendel did is he took a look at this pea generation, in which Mendel cross-fertilized a purebred pea plant that was purple with a purebred pea plant that was white. This is called the pea generation. So he cross-fertilized them, and then he let them grow. Okay, so the F1 generation is the next generation. It's the offspring of the P generation. All of the F1 generation turned out to be purple. Okay, even though they had white and purple parents, they were all purple. It's almost as if the white flower completely disappeared. Okay, and this also, disproves the blending theory, because if the blending theory were correct, it'd just be like a light purple, a mix of purple and white, and that's not true. Okay, then Mendel let all of those F1 generations self-fertilize, so they fertilize with themselves, which many flowers can do. And the resulting F2 generation, something very interesting happened. In a 3-to-1 ratio, 3/4 of the flowers turned out purple, but 1/4 turned out white. So the white seemed to kind of skip a generation, so to speak, in that there was no white that showed up at all in the F1 generation. But in the F2 generation, quote unquote, the grandchildren, we see the white flowers show up about 25% of the time. And this just didn't happen once. It happened over and over and over again with all these different traits. The shape of the seeds of the pea plants, the seed color, the pod shape, the pod color, the flower position on the stem, even the stem height. Over and over and over again, thousands and thousands of times, Mendel saw this same ratio where the F1 generation was all the same, and in the F2 generation we got a 3-to-1 or a 3/4 to a 1/4 or a 75% to a 25% ratio. So we'll talk about that here in just a minute again. And 2 more words that we need to discuss. Traits and alleles. We kind of saw the definition just a few minutes ago, but we need to dive in a little bit deeper. So, traits and alleles. Okay, alleles, it's kind of a funny word. So trait is something generally that you can see or observe. Sometimes it's inside a person or an organism, but it's generally something that you can see or you can observe the effects of that trait. An allele is the 2 different options for that trait, and sometimes there's more than just 2. So organisms have 2 alleles for each trait, and this is important, 2 alleles for each trait. So, for example, the trait that we could be examining would be flower color, and the alleles, or the 2 different options, would be white or purple. The trait, perhaps, of a puppy or a person or an elephant, I don't know, would be pitch of voice, and it might be high or low. Now we know, people have a whole range of pitch of voice. People don't just have really high voices or really low pitched voices, but for this example, we'll go with it, okay? And to make things even more complicated, alleles are considered to be dominant or recessive. Dominant or recessive, and we'll talk about that right now. So, dominant versus recessive alleles. Dominant alleles, let's start on the left-hand side. Dominant alleles always show up. Okay, so that trait always shows up if we have at least 1 dominant allele. So the dominant wins. Okay, so for example, if someone challenges you to an arm wrestling contest, you'll likely use your dominant hand or the one that you use the most often. It's probably the strongest and the one you're most comfortable with. If you win, you can say you were dominant over over your opponent, and you can gloat. Dominant alleles are written as a capital letter. Okay, so you must have at least 1 dominant allele, and that's the one that you'll see, and it is written as a capital letter. Now, recessive allele only shows up if both alleles for a trait are recessive, and this is written as a lowercase letter. So let's look at some examples. Capital A, both alleles are dominant. We know that because they're both capital letters. Capital letter, lowercase letter means 1 dominant allele, 1 recessive allele, but we will see the dominant since we have at least 1 present. Okay. Lowercase a, both alleles are recessive. Okay, both alleles are recessive, and we'll see the recessive trait because there is no dominant to kind of overshadow it or dominate over that trait. So let's see this with something that we can see in humans. So the trait we're examining now is eye color. Alleles, we're going to keep it simple, even though this is not necessarily the case. We'll say the alleles can be blue or brown. So those are the 2 options for eye color. Brown is dominant, so we'll call it capital E, using E for eye or eye color. Blue is recessive, so we will call it lowercase e. Okay, so let's take a look at this. The first generation, which is the P generation. Let's say these are grandparents in a family. We have blue-eyed, okay, which will be little e, and we know it must be little e, because we need 2 recessive alleles to see the recessive trait, which is blue. And then we'll say the other grandparent there shown in the square, we'll say that we know somehow that grandparent is big E for brown eyes. Okay, so big E, and little e. Now they all have children, okay? These grandparents, they have 3 offspring, and As kind of expected from Gregor Mendel's work, the F1 generation are all brown-eyed. Okay, they all have big E, little e. They get one little e from mom, one big E from dad. Okay, so they all have brown eyes because there is a capital letter, which means that is the dominant allele. Okay, now the next generation, the F2 generation, we see one blue-eyed offspring, which we know has to be little e, because if it had any capital letter big E's, it would be brown eyes. So that person definitely has little e for the two alleles. Now, they also had two more children who had brown eyes, and we don't know exactly what the alleles are for those brown eyes. It could be big E, little e, or big E, big E. We just can't be quite sure. Because either way, the dominant allele is going to show up. Okay, as long as there's at least one, that's the allele, that's the trait that we see. Okay, so here's a little recap, introduction to genetics. Gregor Mendel, he was the father of modern genetics, even though he wasn't told that at the time. He bred pea plants, and by breeding pea plants over and over and over again, thousands and thousands of times, he figured out that traits are passed individually from one generation to the next. Okay. Traits, that word we talked about, are things that you can see or observe about an organism. They are determined by genes. And we need two alleles for each trait. And one of those alleles can be dominant, one can be recessive. The dominant one is shown by a capital letter, and that one will always show up if it is present. And the recessive allele is shown with a lowercase letter, and that one will only show up if we have two lowercase alleles for a trait. Otherwise, it's kind of hidden. Okay? Hopefully that wasn't too terribly confusing for you. We will do lots of practice and work with this in class, so if you're totally confused, that's okay. Hopefully we'll clear it up during class time. And now, since you spent 17 minutes listening to a lecture about genetics, your reward is a super adorable video about hedgehogs. So kick back and enjoy.